Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are when you are listening to this. We're going to talk today about the book of Esther. We just celebrated Purim last week, and it was a great holiday, and we had all a good time. And of course, Purim is a celebration that is recorded in the book of Esther. It's a celebration that comes from the great salvation that was brought to the Jewish people as a result of Mordecai and Esther and how they handled the crisis as Haman was plotting to kill the Jewish people, and how they brought Achashverosh to understand that he needed to switch that decree. And at the end, what was originally planned to be literally a Holocaust of the Jewish people throughout the Persian kingdom, Persian Empire, became a day of victory and celebration for the Jewish people as they vanquished their enemies. So that's the story, and that's what we have celebrated. But what I'd like to do today is kind of just take you through the book of Esther with some thoughts and background and understanding. Now, I've studied the book of Esther with a number of different teachers over the years. Most recently, I have a Bible teacher that I've been studying with for many, many years. His name is Rabbi Elchanan Samet, and some of what I will be sharing with you today, I have studied with him, and it reflects his perspective, which I find very refreshing. And much of what I'm going to say as well, of course, is my own vision, a perspective, but whatever. Let's get started. Okay. So first of all, I'd like to give you a bit of an introduction. What are we talking about in the book of Esther? Where does it take place? Of course, we are in the Persian Empire. We're at the court of the king. And it, of course, begins with a party. And over and over again, the book of Esther tells us about the many, many countries and nationalities that are underneath or that are part of the Persian Empire. The first verse in the story talks about 127 different countries that have been conquered by the Persians and are coming in within the jurisdiction of the Persian Empire. One of the things that's very interesting that historians tell us about the Persian Empire was that unlike many of the empires that came before and after, the Persians were actually very, very tolerant. They did not try to turn every one of their subjects into a Persian. And I think this is reflected in this first verse, where we talk about the Persian Empire, which controls 127 different nations or states. So they're not trying to turn them all into the same thing. They recognize that this vast empire includes people of many different nationalities and many different faiths, and that's fine. And in fact, historians tell us that at the time, the Persians encouraged and allowed each of their subjects to build temples. We know, for example, of Cyrus. We read about Cyrus in the book of Ezra. And Cyrus, which is when Cyrus ascends to the throne, it actually brings the Persian Empire, defeats Babylon, and we now have the Persian Empire taking charge of a vast area. When Cyrus declares and enables the Jews to go back to Judea, to the land of Israel, and to rebuild the temple, that kind of declaration actually was something that the Persians made for other nations as well. So we are not talking about an empire that at its core is racist per se, or that is trying to erase the separate identities of each of the nationalities which it controls. It is not trying to restrict the beliefs or belief systems of these various peoples, but rather tolerates all of it. And I think that's a very, very important thing to understand when we meet the Jewish community of Shushan, which is the capital of Persia, or this area. This is where the king sits. It's the royal capital. Who are these people? Who are these Jews that are in Persia and in the center of Persia? Jews who are not only somewhere flung around, Persia, but they are in Persia, very close to the government, very close to the centers of power. And we get a hint of that just by looking at the names of our two main Jewish characters in this story, Esther and Mordecai. Esther, actually, we are told, has two names. Esther's name is also Hadassah. Now, Hadassah is a classic Hebrew name. Hadass is a myrtle bush, and Hadassah would be the feminine of that. So she is named not only a Hebrew name, but she is named for a plant that is considered typical of the land of Israel. And in fact, it is a plant that is part of the lulav, the palm branch that we take with us to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. We have the citron, the lemon-looking fruit, together with the palm branch, and then there are two different branches that go with that we hold together. One is the myrtle, and the other is the willow. So this myrtle is not only typical of the land of Israel, but it is one of these branches that is used in holy celebration, and that would have been used in the temple in the land of Israel. So her original name is Hadassah, which is a very Jewish name, connected to the Jewish faith, connected to the land of Israel. However, we see her in a completely different name, Esther. Esther is actually a Persian name, and the source of that name is Ishtar, which is a Persian goddess of fertility, very similar to the same goddess Ashtoreth, for example, with similar names spread out throughout the Middle East. This is a pagan god of fertility. Mordecai only has one name. Mordecai's name is also a Persian name, and it is from the name Mordok, which is a Persian god. So we have two characters here, both who are Jewish, both who are in Persia, and yet they both have, they may be Jewish, but they both have Persian names. And in fact, the names that they are most known by are their Persian names. So even though we know Esther has a Hebrew name, that's just something that is mentioned by the by. Both of these people are known by their Persian names. So what does this tell us? This tells us that these two people are part of a Jewish reality in Persia that is moving in the direction of assimilation. They are already several generations in Persia. This is, if we look at this, this is already a few kings after Cyrus, and we're going to deal with what that means later on, which means that Jews have already been in Persia or in Babylon, which then becomes Persia. They have been here for over 100 years, and they are assimilating. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't believe in the one God of Israel. I'm sure they still do. But they are little by little taking on the ways of their neighbors. They're taking on their names. And what we can see about Mordecai in particular, we see over and over that Mordecai is mentioned as sitting in the gates of the king. What does that mean? It's, don't think of it as just, okay, there's this big double door that you open and you get the palace, and that's where he sits. The gates of the city, or the gates of the capital, but the gates of any city throughout the biblical times, refers to a central area where either the central commerce takes place, or the central government takes place, or both, and very often the courts as well. So if we're talking about the gates of the city here, and this is where Mordecai is sitting, he is basically sitting in the heart of the government offices. This is where all the important people are. This is where the politicians are, and he's there. He wants to be there. He wants to be close to power. So if we look at Mordecai from this perspective, we have a man who's very wise, who is probably a leader within the Jewish community, but he is very close to the seat of power, and he wants to be there. And he wants to become Persian. He wants, at least outwardly, to look and dress and act and behave like any other Persian. And this then lends a certain significance to his instruction to Esther. When she goes into the palace, he says to her, be very careful, do not reveal your background. Now, on the one hand, we said that Persia is very liberal, very tolerant. So what's the big deal? Why couldn't she say, well, I'm Jewish? Clearly, then, Mordecai has an agenda here. He's looking to get closer to the seat of power, and he wants to be Persian. Now, I'm not sure that that means he wants to deny his Judaism. I don't think so at all. I think he has a very definite Jewish identity, as does Esther. But what he wants to be sure is that he's not showing it, flaunting it, or revealing it in any way that could possibly come in the way of their advancement. Now, there are many people who have asked, how is it that Mordecai would allow or encourage even Esther to go into the king? Did she have a choice? Could she have been hidden? And there's a lot of ways of looking at that, but there's one perspective that actually I only was exposed to recently that I thought is worth considering, that perhaps Esther, like all the other girls of the kingdom, and Mordecai as well, thought that this was a really nice opportunity. I don't know. That's a bit of a controversial way of looking at it. I think traditionally we look at the fact that Esther had no choice, that she was pulled into this whole contest of young maidens. And that's also a very, very possible way of seeing it. Anyway, let's move on. Let's move on to the story. So the first thing that we notice about Mordecai and his encounter with Haman. Let's start with Haman first of all. Haman is first introduced to us only in chapter 3. Okay, we learn about Haman, and the first thing we learn about him is that he is the son of Hamdatha, the Agagite. Who's the Agagite? Okay, if you remember Agag? Agag was the king of Amalek that Saul was commanded to destroy by Samuel, and he failed. If you remember, he really destroyed most of the people, but he kept the livestock alive and he kept the king. Samuel was very, very disappointed and very critical of Saul as a result of this, and in fact, it was as a result of this sin that he lost the kingdom. Now, Agag was killed at that point by Samuel, so Agag is gone. And he did kill most of the people, or at least all of the people. That is our understanding at that time. But what we do know about this nation of Amalek is that they are a very evil nation. It's a nation that we first meet in the book of Exodus, right after the parting of the Red Sea, right after the children of Israel leave Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea, they come to a place called Rephidim. And this is the first place where they are attacked. Many years later, there will be, many years later in the desert, they will have to fight against some of the other nations. But Amalek, now at the very beginning, this is the nation that God has performed many, many miracles to. And if you listen to the words of the Song of Moses, Moses talks about how as a result of the parting of the Red Sea, all the nations of Canaan and the nations of Amorite are now just totally in awe and fearful of the nation of Israel. Well, that clearly didn't apply to Amalek, because it was just at that point that Amalek decided to take advantage of this nation of former slaves that are struggling through the desert and attack them. And it is a result of that that God commands us to wipe out the nation of Amalek. Amalek comes to represent the quintessential anti-Semite, if we're using modern terminology, quintessential enemy of the nation of Israel, because for no reason Israel did not bother Amalek, did not take Amalek's land, did not provoke Amalek in any way. Amalek just saw an opportunity, a weak nation that they thought they could take advantage, and heck, why not? Let's attack them, let's destroy them. Haman here is a descendant of that very same nation. In fact, he's a descendant of Agag, that same king who Saul did not kill initially. Now, there's actually some commentary on this that says, well, there was a bit of interval in time there between the time that Samuel, the nation of Amalek at that point was destroyed, and the time that Samuel discovered that Agag was still alive and ultimately killed him. And during that time, Agag managed to impregnate somebody who then had his descendant. Now, whether it happened that way or whether Saul himself just didn't manage to murder all of the descendants of Agag, I think there's something significant in the fact that this is who Haman is. He is a descendant of this king, of this nation, whose whole essence is to hate the Jewish people and to try to destroy them. Mordecai, on the other hand, is of the tribe of Benjamin. And in fact, we notice in part of the genealogy of Mordecai is a man named Kish. Now, Saul is a son of Kish. So there's no question here that the book of Esther is setting up two adversaries. Mordecai as the descendant of Saul, Haman as the descendant of Agag, as if to say, okay, we're getting another chance at this. Saul messed up the first time, and as a result of that mess up, we now have a Haman that we're dealing with. Mordecai is going to be given the opportunity as the descendant of Saul to make good on the whole thing and finally defeat this Haman. On a more symbolic level, of course, what this conflict represents and how it has been taken by Jews through all the centuries, this conflict is a classic example of anti-Semitism. Now, we, the Jewish people, of course, have been subject to anti-Semitism and to persecution and destruction throughout the ages. We were exiled from our land almost 2,000 years ago, and throughout that time, until the creation of the State of Israel, and of course, even today in the State of Israel, our Arab enemies, although they are today nations coming against the nation of Israel, but it is not very much different in its essence from classic anti-Semitism. But we have always divided the expression of anti-Semitism into two different types. There are those who are particularly hateful and hate what we represent as a faith. And what they're trying to do is not get rid of us as a people, but to destroy our faith. And therefore, we've had many, and this unfortunately was particularly representative of Christian anti-Semitism during many times of our history, where the goal was not so much to kill the Jews as to force them to convert. And if they were to convert, then they would be spared being murdered. If they would not convert, then they would be murdered. That's one kind of anti-Semitism. Another kind of anti-Semitism is what we saw during the Holocaust. Hitler did not care if a Jew identifies as a Jew, was a religious Jew. Jews who had converted to Christianity were just as much subject to the final solution as Jews that remained Jewish in any form of Jewish faith. For Hitler, it was the essence of being Jewish, the bloodline of being Jewish that he was after, and he wanted to wipe out the Jewish presence from the face of the earth. If we look at what Haman is doing here, he is closer to the type of anti-Semitism that Hitler represented. He didn't care about Mordecai's faith, and in fact, if we view Mordecai as being a very Persian Jew, he's not standing out, he's not walking in the streets wearing prayer shawls and blowing shofars. He's dressing like a Persian, and he's sitting in the court. Haman hates the Jews as Jews, and in fact, we see that exact description of him in chapter 3, verse 10, where he's just, where it says it's just a not a very dramatic verse. It's that the king removes his own ring from his hand and he gives it to Haman. And now we see how is Haman described. Haman, the son of Hamdatah, the Agagite, who despises or hates the Jews. That's who Haman is. And one of the ways that we see this played out is when everybody in the land is bowing down to Haman, Mordecai refuses. And many people have asked, why does he refuse to bow down to him? And again, we have many situations where, for example, during the Hasmonean period, this is of course much later, in Israel, when the Syrian Greeks make decrees forcing the Jews to bow down to idols, to worship Greek idols, then of course Jews refuse to do that, because in bowing to these idols, you are not just showing some kind of respect to a leader, but you are acknowledging this pagan faith. And in that case, the Jews, of course, will very often have martyred themselves rather than bow down to an idol. There is no indication, however, that Haman sees himself as a god. Haman is just a high-level political leader, and people are bowing to him in the way that people bow their heads today, curtsy or salute or whatever, to figures of authority or to kings, queens, and princesses. There's nothing pagan about that. So many people ask, so then why is Mordecai making such a fuss? And indeed, is refusal to bow what then brings out Haman's anger and the decree to murder all the Jews. I think if we put together this idea of Haman, who was first introduced to us as an Agagite, and later on we are told that he hates the Jews, it seems that Mordecai himself, that Haman himself had a reputation. Everybody knew he hated the Jews. And from the beginning then, when Mordecai refuses to bow down to Haman, he is doing this from a national point of view. As a Jew, he is not going to show deference and respect to someone who is a blatant anti-Semite. And so in this conflict of a sort between Haman and Mordecai, at the very beginning, we see already the beginning of Mordecai starting to identify more positively and more openly as a Jew. Again, I don't think Mordecai has at any point hidden his being Jewish, but on the other hand, he is not talking about it, he's not flaunting it, and he is very much trying to be a Persian like everyone else, until such point as he encounters anti-Semitism. And when he counters anti-Semitism, initially just in Haman, he begins to understand, now, wait a second, this is a line I will not cross. I will not compromise my identity in order to get ahead. I am not going to bow or show deference to Haman. Okay, so this is kind of how it all begins. And of course, things rapidly get out of hand. Haman is furious at Mordecai. And again, if he was just furious at Mordecai, it would not have turned into this decree. It is the fact that his friends or his colleagues tell him, Mordecai, he's Jewish, by the way, that it becomes for him an expression of his hatred for the Jews. It is easy for him to pin his hatred of Mordecai, his hatred of the Jews on Mordecai, because he has this inborn hatred of the Jews already. And this has just fueled him and brought him to a point where he's going to go to the king, to Ahasuerus, and say to him, okay, let's do this. Let's put out the decree against the Jewish people. Now, one thing I have to say something about Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus is very often seen as an idiot. I don't think he's an idiot. I think he has absolutely no morals. He has no stand. He cares about one thing, himself, his power. And you can see that initially with the story of Vashti, because he's very insulted that she wouldn't come before him when she was called. And so therefore he makes this whole decree and he banishes her, etc. And at the end of chapter 1, it's very interesting. We have the language of the decree. And what does he say? His purpose of this whole thing, so that every man should remain in charge or ruling in his own home. For Ahasuerus, Vashti has insulted his masculinity, has insulted his honor, and on behalf of the men of Persia, he is going to make this decree. There's nothing about political advancement here. It's about an insult to his own prestige, his own reputation, and on that basis, he's going to act in a very extreme fashion. Haman now is a very popular and a very powerful man, and therefore, chances are Ahasuerus gives him the key, the ring, and allows him to do whatever he wants. He doesn't care about the Jews. He doesn't like them. He doesn't dislike them. He cares about his own posture. He cares about his own power, and he wants to make sure a man like Haman, who is gaining power, is going to be on his side and not against him. So that's also a very important perspective. Okay, let's go to where it really gets exciting. Chapter 4. After this decree has come out and Mordecai finds out about it, what do we see him doing? He puts on sackcloth and ashes. He dresses in typical Jewish fashion of mourning. And he goes out into the city and he calls out this call of mourning. He continues to sit in the gates of the king wearing this dress. Mordecai has become very Jewish. He has outwardly now taken on the clothes of mourning in complete and total identification with the fate that will befall his people. He has, in his own way, completely turned from a man whose main interest is getting ahead to his main interest being saving his people. Now, Esther, meanwhile, sequestered in the palace, doesn't know what's going on. All she knows is that someone comes to her and says, your uncle is dressed kind of funny, like, what's going on here? And she's very concerned because she understands the way he's dressed must represent something very serious. And he sends her a message and tells her what's going on. And he asks her, Mordecai actually demands that she go before the king. Now, this constitutes grave danger for Esther because the rules in the harem are the king can call any woman he wants at any time, but she may not initiate that contact. If he hasn't called her, she cannot go forward. And so therefore she expresses this fear. And what has Mordecai said? If you will, he says, don't be afraid for your own life. This is not the time to worry about your own safety. And very, very interesting terms, he says, in order to escape into the palace of the king from all the Jews. What is he saying to her? This is not a time to pretend you're not Jewish. All along I told you, don't reveal your Judaism to the king. Finished. We're changing that plan. This is not the time to escape into the palace of the king and escape your Judaism. This is at the time from within the palace of the king to declare your Judaism and use your position in order to save your people. And I just love, of course, the way he says to her, who knows if but for a time like this you have come to the kingdom. So what may have begun initially as Mordecai kind of saying, yeah, Esther, go in, why not? Or if you don't have to, if you have to, it's a bad thing, but who knows, maybe you'll become powerful. Here Mordecai realizes that perhaps God has engineered this. And this is our first inkling. God is not mentioned, by the way, in the entire book of Esther. But this is the first place that we have an inkling that Mordecai realized God may be playing behind the scenes. Who knows if but for a time like this, what do you mean, who knows if but for a time like this? In other words, that someone is behind the scenes and moving the pieces around, and maybe that's why you're there in the palace, and this is what you need to do. There is one place that we see as being a more obvious hint of God's presence. At the beginning of chapter 6, we have, on that night, the king had trouble sleeping, and we don't have the king's name. What it says here, on that night, the king, was awake, or his sleep escaped him. Now, that is a very interesting turning point in the story, because just before then, Haman has been plotting to kill, he's frustrated about Mordecai, and his wife and associate says, oh, let's just hang him. And this is great, we're going to hang him. And they build this big high tree to hang Mordecai. Right after that, we have this situation where Haman has come to the courtyard of the king to tell him about his idea of hanging Mordecai. But at the very same time, because the king is having trouble sleeping, he is reading his chronicles and discovers that it was actually Mordecai who had saved his life and who has not been properly rewarded. So we have this total twist of events where Haman comes to the king in order to get the king to allow him to hang Mordecai. And in the end, Haman walks out of there having to honor Mordecai. And so this twist in the story actually represents the twist in the entire larger story. What begins as a plot that looks like it will be successful to destroy the Jewish people, of course, becomes the opposite. Instead of Mordecai hanging on the tree, it is Haman who hangs on the tree. Instead of the Jews being murdered by the Persians, it is the Persians who are murdered by the Jews. And so here we have that switch that is happening. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about Esther at this point, because Esther is revealed to us as really a very amazing character. She starts as a woman who is totally subservient to Mordecai. She listens to his instructions. She doesn't reveal her nationality in the court. She goes into the court. She is totally subservient to the king. She is subservient to all the servants around her. And she's extremely frightened about going to the king without being summoned. And yet Mordecai says to her, no, you have no choice. You've got to do it. And at that moment, as if in a split second, she understands that she has a completely different role to play. She can no longer just be this, following the instructions and going with the flow and making sure everything is good. She's got to take a stand. She has to reveal her Judaism to the king, which she will ultimately do at the second party. And she's got to manipulate events in such a way that her people are saved. Now, one of the things that she does do is that she organizes a fast, and she asks that all the Jews in Persia fast with her, or at least the Jews in Shushan, fast with her to bring strength and to have God's assistance. It's very interesting. They talk about fasting and they talk about praying, but they don't talk about God. Again, God is outside of this story. He's very much behind the scenes. He's pulling the strings, but he's not here directly. And that is part of the charm of this book, because in many ways it reflects how we live our lives. We don't have God speaking to us. We don't have partings of the Red Sea and revelations of Sinai. Our lives are lived very much like the characters in the book of Esther. And yet, we see circumstances. We understand through events and through our own faith that God is really behind the scenes, pulling the strings. And for that reason also, this book of Esther speaks so strongly, not just to us as Jews, as being so typical of so many of the situations that Jews found themselves in throughout the ages, where things sometimes worked out for the good and sometimes they did not work out for the good. But in every case, when we were saved, when there was salvation, even a partial salvation, there was no parting of the Red Sea. And yet we as Jews knew that this was God intervening for us. And our ability to read that into what was happening is something that I believe is one of the messages, one of the most powerful messages in this book. I'd like to conclude our lesson today with a question, okay? A question that has only arisen in my life in the last, few decades when I'm here living in Israel. We celebrated the holiday of Purim for many years. It's something that Jews have celebrated all over the world, and actually, it is always considered a holiday of the diaspora, because the entire book of Esther none of it takes place in the land of Israel. In fact, the land of Israel is not even mentioned in the book of Esther. The question is, when did it take place? And if you read the book of Esther in conjunction with the book of Ezra, you will find some very, very interesting revelations. So in the book of Ezra, in chapter 4, verse 6, there's a very interesting statement. The beginning of chapter 4, in any case, gives us a little bit of, we have a few different kings of the house of Persia, of the Persian Empire. Different ones are mentioned. And we have in verse 6, and during the kingdom of Ahasuerus, at the beginning of his reign, they wrote decrees of hatred against the dwellers of Judah and Jerusalem. Now, it's fairly clear that this little verse is referring to the whole story of the book of Esther. Now, in the book of Esther, we don't know anything about the land of Israel. Here, in the book of Ezra, we don't know anything about the land of Persia. Now, during the book of Ezra, they are part of the Persian Empire. And of course, what we discussed earlier, the fact that it was the Persians who allowed them to build the temple, it was Cyrus who first decreed that, and then the different kings stopped it or encouraged that to go forward. And we have that whole story set forth for us in the book of Ezra. But what we see here is how the decree of Haman and Ahasuerus that we read about in Esther played itself out in Judea and Jerusalem. Keep in mind that there were Jews living in Judea and Jerusalem at the time, and they too were affected by this decree. They too were in great peril that their not Persian or non-Jewish neighbors would rise up against them and murder them with the blessing of the emperor of Ahasuerus. So clearly this is something that plays in here. But if we see the series of things that goes on here, it becomes very clear that Ahasuerus is a king that is after Cyrus and after Darius, which means that the story of Esther takes place after the temple has already been built in Jerusalem. Which begs the question, why were Mordecai and Esther in Persia and not in Israel? Now, remember what I said at the beginning? How when we meet Mordecai and Esther at the beginning of the story, they are assimilated Jews? This is so typical of Jews, and is something that we see so much today around the world. So many people have asked me, why is it that the Jews of the United States, or the Jews of Australia, or the Jews of all these other countries where they are treated well, why aren't they going to Israel? Now, there are always Jews going to Israel. There were Jews like Ezra who were just as successful in Persia as Mordecai. He was also a leader, and yet he chose to come to Israel and to lead the nation back to the land and rebuild the existence of the Jewish people in the land of Israel, and to build the temple there. But Mordecai was from a different type of Jew. He stayed in Persia. He did not come to the land of Israel. And if you see this historical reality against what we discussed about what we see in the book of Esther, I think this whole process of assimilation to Jewish identity is something that perhaps God is doing in Persia. Maybe part of this whole story in Esther is to wake up the Jews of Persia and say, yes, life is good for you here in Persia, but first of all, there's still plenty of anti-Semites in there around you, and life in Persia is not so predictable. One day you can be close to the king, and the next day you're going to be subject to the decree of Haman. Maybe it's a wake-up call so that more and more Jews will be forced to realize their Jewish identity, and hopefully, as a result of that, come to Israel. Now, Mordecai and Esther, we have no indication that they ever came to Israel. At the end of the story, in fact, they become even more powerful in the kingdom of Persia. But they become more powerful as Jews. And in fact, we have at the end of the story, we have that many of the nations come to Judaism as a result of Mordecai and Esther. In other words, they stand there as real Jews, giving this identity. Now, I'm not going to judge Mordecai and Esther and say they should have come to Israel, they shouldn't have come to Israel, but I think it is the book of Ezra that takes the story of Mordecai and Esther to where it needs to go, where initially the Jews who came back to Israel, to Judea, to Jerusalem, were stragglers, were from the poorer sections. Somehow, over time, that develops into a temple that is completed, more and more Jews coming back into the land, and with the beginning of the Second Temple period, the focus of the Jewish community moves from Persia and Babylon to the land of Israel. And if I look at that one sentence in the book of Ezra, where during the time of Ahasuerus, there were problems with the people in Judea, no mention of the problems that face the people in Persia, because with the book of Esther, the focus changes to the Jews who are in the land of Israel. They are the ones who truly make a difference, because they are the ones who are at the focus of God's redemption plans. There's no question this is a powerful message for us today. I am blessed to have been one of the Jews who originally was in the modern day Persia in the United States and understood that the future of the Jewish community is in Israel. And it was because I was educated with such a strong Jewish identity that it was very easy for me to decide to move to Israel. It was a no-brainer. And I hope you will join me in hoping and praying that the rest of our Jewish brothers and sisters, those who are still in the land of, in the lands around the easy and wealthy lands where Jews do well, and look in the United States, President Trump is surrounded by Jewish advisors. It's amazing, and they are doing well, I think, for the Jewish people. But wouldn't it be better if all of these Jews were come to Israel, would understand the fullness of their Jewish identity, and realize that it's only here in the land of Israel that can really be fulfilled to the greatest level. One last thing that I just wanted to mention, going back to where we are today, sitting in our houses and in our rooms and wondering about Corona, you know, you don't always see God, but you need to know He's there. His name might not be mentioned in the newspapers. His name was not mentioned in the book of Esther, but He was certainly there, handling things, moving things in the right direction, and in the end, bringing us to salvation. I am confident and hopeful at the same time, and I want to ask you to join me in prayer that God indeed will look at the mess that is going on here on earth and help us get out of this coronavirus crisis, which may be some kind of symbol of the so many crises that we're in now. May all of humanity take this time of seclusion to turn to God. Let us all come out of this a stronger, more faithful humanity. Thank you.